Dawn light filtered through the cabin window and touched the old woman's face. Her eyes opened slowly, clouded with confusion and pain. Jake had been awake for an hour already, keeping the fire strong and preparing weak broth from the rabbit he had caught. He saw her stir and moved closer to the bed. She flinched when she noticed him, fear flashing across her weathered features. He raised his hands to show he meant no harm and spoke in the gentlest voice he could manage. She relaxed slightly, but her eyes remained cautious. The woman tried to sit up but gasped and fell back against the pillows. Her leg, her head, everything hurt. Jake brought her water first, lifting her head carefully so she could drink. She sipped slowly, her throat working with difficulty. After the water, he offered the broth. She managed a few spoonfuls before exhaustion claimed her again. This pattern repeated throughout the morning. She would wake, drink a little, eat a little, then sleep again. Her body was fighting hard to heal itself. By afternoon, she stayed awake longer. She studied Jake with dark eyes that had seen many years. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Her English was broken but understandable.
She told him her name was Mary Blackfeather.
She belonged to the Shoshone people. Her reservation lay 3 days' walk beyond the eastern mountains. Jake listened without interrupting, letting her tell the story at her own pace. Mary explained that her husband had died the previous winter. He had been a respected elder, a keeper of traditions and stories. His death had left a hole in her heart that would not heal. She had decided to make a spiritual journey to the sacred places her husband had loved. She wanted to feel close to him one more time, to speak to his spirit among the high peaks where earth touched sky. She had set out alone despite the warnings of her children and grandchildren. The journey was something she needed to do. Everything had gone well for the first 2 days. Mary had visited the places she remembered from long ago, when she and her husband had been young. She had prayed at the old sites and left offerings of tobacco and cornmeal. But on the 3rd day, an unexpected storm had rolled in. Snow and wind had confused her path. She had tried to find shelter, but the ground had given way beneath her feet. She remembered falling, tumbling down rocks, then nothing until she woke in this cabin with a strange white man tending her wounds. Mary looked at Jake with gratitude shining in her tired eyes. She knew she had been dying when he found her. The cold would have taken her within hours. He had saved her life. She reached out a trembling hand and Jake took it gently. Her skin felt papery thin, but her grip was surprisingly strong. She spoke a blessing in her native language, words that sounded like music and wind. Jake felt uncomfortable with her gratitude. He had simply done what anyone would do. But Mary shook her head when he said this. Not everyone would stop to help an old Indian woman in the middle of nowhere. Many would have walked past or not even heard her cries. He had chosen to listen, to care, to act. That said something about who he was inside. Jake did not know how to respond, so he just nodded and went to stir the fire. Over the next day, Mary grew stronger, but it became clear her injuries were severe. The broken leg would take months to heal properly. The head wound had stopped bleeding but left her dizzy and weak. Her ribs hurt when she breathed. She was old, she told Jake matter-of-factly, and old bodies did not bounce back like young ones. She did not expect to leave this cabin alive. She said this without sadness or fear, just acceptance. Jake protested. He could go for help, bring back doctors. But Mary smiled and shook her head. Her time had come. She could feel it in her bones. The journey had been her way of saying goodbye to the world. Finding this cabin, meeting this kind stranger, it was the spirits showing her mercy. She would not die alone and afraid on a cold mountainside. Instead, she would pass in warmth and peace, cared for by a good man. This was more than she had hoped for. Something about her calm acceptance broke through the walls Jake had built around his heart. He found himself talking, really talking for the first time in 7 years. He told her about his wife and daughter, about the accident that had taken them, about the guilt and rage that had driven him into these mountains. Mary listened without judgment, her eyes compassionate and wise. When he finished, she spoke softly. She told him that grief was love with nowhere to go. That running from pain did not make it smaller. It just made the person carrying it more alone. She said her people believed that those who died remained connected to those who lived through memory and love. His wife and daughter were not truly gone as long as he held them in his heart. Hiding from the world dishonored their memory because it meant hiding the love they had shared. Her words struck deep. Jake had never thought of it that way. He had believed that isolation protected him from more pain. but maybe it had just frozen him in the moment of loss, unable to move forward or back. He sat with these thoughts as the fire crackled and Mary dozed beside it. That evening, Mary asked Jake to help her sit up properly. She wanted to see the sunset through the window. He arranged pillows behind her and opened the door so the last light could stream in. The sky burned orange and pink and gold, painting the mountains in colors that seemed almost unreal. Mary smiled and spoke prayers in Shoshone, her voice gaining strength from the beauty before her. She talked about her life, her 7 children, her 23 grandchildren, her 4 great-grandchildren. She spoke of the traditions she had learned from her grandmother and passed to her own grandchildren. She told stories of the old days and the new days, of hardships and joys. Jake listened and found himself fascinated. This woman had lived a full life, rich with connections and meaning. Even facing death, she radiated a kind of peace he envied. As darkness fell, Mary grew tired again. Jake helped her lie back down and pulled the blankets up to her chin. She thanked him again, calling him a gift from the spirits. She said that when she crossed over, she would tell her ancestors about the mountain man who had shown such kindness to an old woman he did not know. She would make sure they blessed him and watched over him. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. He thought he had forgotten how to feel. He made dinner and they ate together in comfortable silence. Mary managed several bites of the stew he had prepared. Afterward, she told him about her husband, how they had met as teenagers, how he had courted her with carved figures and songs, how they had built a life together through good times and bad, how even now, months after his death, she sometimes forgot he was gone and turned to tell him something. Love like that never really ended, she said. It just changed form. Night deepened and the fire burned low. Mary's breathing became more labored. Jake could see her fading, but there was nothing he could do except be present. He sat beside the bed holding her hand. Around midnight, she opened her eyes one last time. She looked at Jake and smiled. She whispered something in Shoshone, a blessing or farewell. Then she sighed softly and was gone. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling fire. Jake sat there for a long time, still holding her hand, feeling like something important had happened that he did not fully understand. This stranger had touched his life for barely 2 days, but somehow everything felt different. He finally released her hand and gently closed her eyes. Then he sat back and let tears fall. Jake sat in the darkness for hours after Mary passed. He had witnessed death before, but this felt different somehow. This woman had been a complete stranger when he found her. Yet in their brief time together, she had reminded him what it meant to be human. To care, to connect, to feel something beyond the numbness that had consumed him for 7 years. The weight of her loss pressed against his chest like a physical thing. As dawn approached, Jake knew he had to make decisions. He could walk down to Pine Ridge, report finding a body, let the authorities handle it. That would be the simple path. But something in him rebelled against that choice. Mary had spoken of traditions, of her people, of spiritual beliefs that mattered deeply to her. She deserved better than being processed through some cold system that would not understand or care about who she had been. He stood and looked at her peaceful face in the growing light. She had trusted him in her final hours. The least he could do was honor that trust. He would give her a burial worthy of the remarkable woman she had been. He had no idea if he would do it correctly according to her traditions, but he would do his best. His intentions were pure even if his knowledge was limited. Jake spent the morning preparing Mary's body with as much respect as he knew how. He washed her gently with warm water and dressed her in the cleanest clothes he could find. He left her wearing the small medicine pouch that had been around her neck, figuring it held spiritual significance. He wrapped her carefully in his best blankets, the ones his wife had made years ago. Somehow that felt right. One woman's handiwork protecting another. Finding the right burial place took time. Jake walked the surrounding area looking for a spot that felt appropriate. He finally chose a clearing about half a mile from the cabin. It sat on a small rise with a perfect view of the valley below. The morning sun hit it first thing each day. Wildflowers grew there in summer. It was beautiful and peaceful. Mary had spoken of wanting to be close to nature, to the earth and sky. This place seemed to offer that. The ground had started to freeze with the October cold. Digging took all his strength and most of the day. Jake used his shovel and pickaxe, breaking through the hard surface layer before reaching softer soil beneath. His hands blistered and his back ached, but he did not stop. He dug until the hole was deep enough, proper enough. Sweat soaked his shirt despite the cold air. The physical work felt like penance and prayer combined. When the grave was ready, Jake returned to the cabin. He lifted Mary's wrapped body and carried her to the clearing. She weighed almost nothing, as if death had made her lighter. He placed her gently in the earth, making sure she faced east. He remembered Mary mentioning something about east being important, about facing the rising sun. He hoped he had gotten that detail right. Before covering her, Jake paused. He felt like he should say something, but words seemed inadequate. He had never been religious or particularly spiritual, but standing there above this woman who had touched his life so briefly yet so profoundly, he found himself wanting to speak. He talked to her as if she could still hear him. He thanked her for reminding him what kindness looked like. He promised to remember her stories about love and family. He told her he hoped she had found her husband on the other side. Then Jake began filling in the grave. Each shovelful of earth felt heavy with meaning. He worked slowly, carefully, treating even this final act as sacred. When the hole was filled, he mounded the soil and placed large stones over the top to protect it from animals. He gathered rocks from around the clearing and built a border that marked the space as special. As a final touch, he found 2 fallen branches and lashed them together with cord to form a simple cross. He planted it at the head of the grave. The sun had started its descent by the time Jake finished. He sat beside the grave as afternoon turned to evening. The valley below glowed golden in the fading light. Birds sang their evening songs. A cool breeze moved through the trees. It was the kind of moment Mary had seemed to appreciate, beauty and simplicity. Jake felt her presence somehow, not in any ghostly way, but as a warmth in his chest, a reminder that he had done something that mattered. For the first time since finding her, Jake allowed himself to really feel. He cried for Mary Blackfeather, for the life she had lived and the death she had faced with such grace. He cried for his own wife and daughter, grief he had held frozen for so long finally beginning to thaw. He cried for all the years he had wasted hiding from pain instead of learning to carry it. The tears came hard and cleansing like a storm that had been building for 7 years. When the tears finally stopped, Jake felt different. Lighter somehow. The pain had not disappeared, but it had changed shape, become something he could hold without it destroying him. Mary had been right. Grief was love with nowhere to go. But maybe it did not have to stay trapped inside. Maybe it could flow through him and back out into the world as kindness, as connection, as the choice to help a dying stranger. Night fell and stars emerged overhead. Jake remained sitting beside the grave. He thought about Mary's words about his wife and daughter still being connected to him through memory and love. For years he had tried not to think about them because remembering hurt too much. But sitting there under the stars, he let himself remember the good things. His wife's laugh, his daughter's smile, the way they had made a home full of warmth and joy. Those memories would always carry sadness now, but they also carried something precious. They proved that love had existed, that his life had held meaning. Jake finally stood and brushed dirt from his pants. He spoke one more time to the grave. He told Mary he would keep this place tended. He would make sure she was not forgotten. Then he walked back to his cabin through the darkness, guided by starlight and a strange new sense of purpose. His isolation suddenly felt less like protection and more like punishment. Mary had lived connected to family, to community, to tradition. Even facing death alone in the mountains, she had remained connected to her people in her heart and mind. Maybe that was the real lesson. Connection did not make you vulnerable to pain. Connection was what made pain bearable. Inside the cabin, Jake built up the fire and made himself dinner. The space felt empty without Mary's presence, but not in a bad way. More like something important had happened here and left an echo behind. He ate slowly, thinking about everything she had told him. Her stories about her husband and children, her beliefs about death and spirits, her gentle insistence that running from life was not the same as living. That night, Jake pulled out the books from his shelf for the first time in years. He found one about Native American traditions and read by firelight. He wanted to understand more about Mary's people, to learn if he had honored her properly. The book described burial practices, spiritual beliefs, the importance of connection to land and ancestors. He could not be sure he had done everything right, but he had done his best with pure intentions. Somehow he felt that mattered most. Sleep came easier than it had in years. Jake dreamed of his wife and daughter, but for once the dreams were not nightmares. They were memories of good times, gentle reminders of love that had been real and true. When he woke the next morning, he felt something he had not felt in 7 years. He felt ready to face the day not just as survival, but as an opportunity. Mary Blackfeather had given him an unexpected gift in her final hours. She had reminded him that life, even with all its pain, was still worth living. He would honor that gift by trying to live again, really live instead of just existing in isolation. Jake woke before dawn to a sound that did not belong to the mountains. At first he thought it was his imagination, his mind still foggy with sleep. But as he lay there listening, the sound grew clearer. It was rhythmic and steady, like distant thunder but not quite, more purposeful, more deliberate. He threw off his blankets and moved to the window. The sky was just beginning to lighten, that pale gray that came before sunrise. The sound continued, growing gradually louder. It reminded Jake of drums but also of hoofbeats. He pulled on his boots and jacket, unease prickling down his spine. In 7 years of living alone in these mountains, he had encountered bears, mountain lions, and harsh weather. But this sound was something entirely different. This sound was human, many humans. He stepped outside into the cold morning air. The sound was definitely closer now, coming from the trail that led up the mountain toward his cabin. Jake's heart began to pound. His first instinct was to grab his rifle, but something stopped him. He stood on his porch and waited, watching the trail where it emerged from the trees. The sky brightened moment by moment. The sound grew louder and more distinct. Definitely hooves. Definitely drums. Many of both. Then they appeared. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Coming up the trail was a procession unlike anything he had ever seen. Men on horseback, men walking. Dozens of them. No, more than dozens. His mind struggled to count. They wore a mix of traditional and modern clothing. Some had long hair bound with leather. Others wore jeans and jackets but carried ceremonial staffs. Flags and banners moved with them. Symbols Jake did not recognize but understood meant something important. They kept coming, more and more of them. Jake felt fear rising in his chest. He was one man facing what looked like an army. But as they drew closer, he noticed something. They were not carrying weapons. At least not weapons of war. No guns, no bows drawn. Instead, they carried items, objects wrapped in cloth, bundles that looked like gifts. Their faces were serious but not hostile, solemn and purposeful. The procession came to a halt about 50 yards from Jake's cabin. He counted quickly, his military training from long ago kicking in. At least 200 people, maybe more. They spread out in a wide formation, creating a semicircle that faced his small cabin. The silence after they stopped felt heavy and loaded with meaning. Jake stood frozen on his porch, uncertain whether he should be terrified or curious. A man dismounted from the lead horse. He was tall and broad-shouldered with gray hair that fell past his shoulders. He wore a magnificent headdress, feathers arranged in a pattern that caught the growing light. His face was weathered and strong, lined with years but radiating authority. He moved with the slow dignity of someone who commanded respect without demanding it. He walked forward alone, stopping about 10 feet from where Jake stood. The silence stretched between them. Jake could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the eyes of 200 people watching this moment. Finally, the man spoke. His voice was deep and clear, his English accented but precise. He introduced himself as Chief Joseph Red Cloud of the Shoshone people. The name meant nothing to Jake, but the title certainly did. This was a leader, someone important. The chief continued speaking. He said they had come because of Mary Blackfeather. Jake's stomach dropped. Of course, they had found the grave. They knew he had been the last person to see her alive. His mind raced through possibilities. Did they think he had hurt her? Killed her? But the chief's next words stopped that spiral of panic. The chief said they knew Jake had given shelter to Mary in her final hours. They knew he had cared for her, tended her wounds, given her warmth and dignity when he could have done nothing. They knew he had buried her with respect, facing east, protected from animals, marked with care. They had read the signs and tracked back to his cabin. They had come to honor him for what he had done. Jake stood speechless. This was not what he had expected. Honor him? He had just done what anyone would do. But the chief shook his head as if reading Jake's thoughts. Not everyone would have stopped. Not everyone would have cared. Not everyone would have shown such respect to the body of an old Indian woman in the middle of nowhere. Jake had done all of these things without thought of reward or recognition. That said everything about who he was. The chief explained that Mary Blackfeather had been more than just an elder. She had been a keeper of stories, a spiritual leader, a grandmother to many. Her family spanned 3 different reservations. When she had not returned from her journey, search parties had gone out. They had eventually found her grave and the cabin nearby. They had pieced together what must have happened. The careful burial, the respectful treatment, it spoke of a good heart. Jake found his voice finally. It came out rough and uncertain. He tried to explain that he had not known who she was, that he had simply tried to help. That he had no knowledge of proper Shoshone traditions and had only done his best. The chief raised a hand to stop him. Intentions mattered more than knowledge. Respect transcended cultural differences. Jake had honored Mary as a human being deserving of dignity. That was what counted. The chief turned and gestured to the people behind him. They began to move forward, still maintaining that sense of ceremony and purpose. They formed a great circle around Jake's cabin in the clearing. He could see them more clearly now in the growing daylight. There were warriors, yes, but also elders and younger people, men and women. Some wore traditional dress, others modern clothes. What united them was the solemnity in their faces and the respect in their movements. They had come from far away, the chief explained. Not just from one reservation, but from 3. Word of Mary's death and Jake's kindness had spread quickly through the tribal communities. The elders had gathered and made a decision. They would honor this stranger who had honored one of their own. They would make a journey to his mountain home and show him that kindness was never forgotten. Jake felt overwhelmed. He had lived alone for 7 years, speaking to almost no one. Now 200 people stood in his clearing because of 2 days with a dying woman. It made no sense. But as he looked at their faces, he saw something he had forgotten existed. He saw community. He saw people bound together by tradition and respect for elders. He saw what Mary had been talking about when she spoke of her people. The chief stepped closer and placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. His grip was firm and warm. He spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. He said that boundaries of tribe and blood did not limit honor and kindness. Today, Jake was no longer a stranger. Today, he became family to the Shoshone people. A cheer went up from the assembled crowd, voices lifting toward the morning sky. Jake felt tears prick his eyes. He had spent 7 years running from family, from connection, from anything that might hurt him. Now family had found him anyway in the most unexpected way possible. The sun finally cleared the mountain peaks, flooding the clearing with golden light. The chief smiled, deep lines crinkling around his eyes. He said they had much to do. They had come to pay their respects to Mary and to honor Jake. They would stay for several days if Jake permitted it. They had brought gifts and food. They wanted to hold ceremonies for Mary's spirit and to welcome Jake into their community. He asked if this would be acceptable. Jake looked at the 200 faces watching him with warmth and respect. He thought about Mary and her words about connection. He thought about 7 years of isolation and loneliness. He thought about his wife and daughter and how they would have wanted him to live rather than hide. The answer came easily. He nodded and found himself smiling for the first time in longer than he could remember. Of course they were welcome. They honored him with their presence. The chief squeezed his shoulder once more, then turned to address his people. Work began immediately as the clearing transformed into something Jake could never have imagined. The clearing transformed within hours into something that felt alive and purposeful. Jake stood to the side watching in amazement as the Shoshone people moved with practiced efficiency. Tents appeared as if by magic, traditional structures and modern camping gear blending together. Fires were built in careful arrangements that suggested ritual significance. People worked together without needing to speak much, everyone knowing their role in this gathering. Chief Red Cloud had assigned someone to stay with Jake and explain what was happening. Her name was Helen Longwater, an elder woman whose face held kindness and wisdom. She stood beside Jake and narrated the preparations in a gentle voice. She told him this was a funeral ceremony combined with an honoring ceremony. They would celebrate Mary's life, help her spirit journey to the ancestors, and recognize Jake's compassion all at once. Helen explained that Mary had been special to many people across multiple reservations. Her husband had been a great chief before his death, a man who had fought to preserve their language and traditions. Mary had continued his work, Teaching children the old stories and keeping ceremonies alive, she had been a bridge between the ancient ways and the modern world. Her loss would be felt deeply, but her memory would be treasured. Jake learned that the gathering had been organized in less than 2 days. Word had spread through the tribal communities about what had happened. Families had dropped everything to make the journey. Some had driven, others had ridden horses in the traditional way. They had converged on the mountains following directions passed from person to person. The fact that so many had come showed how much Mary had been loved and how seriously they took honoring debts of kindness. A large central area was cleared and marked with stones in a circular pattern. This would be the ceremonial space. Helen explained that circles were sacred, representing the cycle of life and the connection of all things. Jake would be asked to stand in that circle later, but for now he should just observe and learn. He nodded, feeling out of his depth but strangely comfortable. These people had accepted him without question or judgment. The preparations took most of the morning. Jake offered to help several times, but was gently guided back to watching. This was their gift to him, Helen said. To include him, to teach him, to show him the ways of the Shoshone people. He should receive this with grace. So Jake watched and learned. He saw how they organized food preparation, how elders were seated first, how children were kept involved but respectful. He saw community in action. Around noon, Chief Red Cloud called for everyone to gather. The entire group of 200 assembled in and around the stone circle. Jake found himself guided to a place of honor near the center. His heart pounded with nervousness, but Helen stood nearby, her presence calming. The chief raised his arms and silence fell immediately. He began to speak in Shoshone, his voice carrying across the clearing with power and authority. Helen whispered translations for Jake. The chief was calling to the 4 directions, asking for blessings from the spirits of east, south, west, and north. He was opening the sacred space and inviting the ancestors to join the ceremony. He spoke Mary's name with reverence, listing her accomplishments and virtues. He spoke of her long life, her devotion to family, her dedication to keeping traditions alive. Listening to the litany of her life, Jake realized he had only glimpsed a small part of who Mary Blackfeather had been. Then the chief switched to English and turned to face Jake directly. He told the gathered people about how Mary had been found, how Jake had cared for her, how he had buried her with honor. He spoke of Jake's isolation, his own losses, and how he had still chosen compassion over indifference. The chief's voice rang with emotion as he declared that this stranger had shown the true spirit of what it meant to be human. He had given dignity to an elder when he owed nothing and expected nothing in return. Other people began to speak, coming forward one by one to share memories of Mary. An old man told of how she had taught him traditional songs when he was a boy. A younger woman spoke through tears about Mary delivering her first baby. A teenage boy described how Mary had patiently taught him to speak Shoshone when he had almost given up on learning. Each story added layers to Jake's understanding of who he had helped in her final hours. Several people also spoke about what Jake's actions meant to them. They said that in a world where Native Americans were often ignored or dismissed, his choice to honor Mary showed respect that transcended race and culture. They said it restored their faith that kindness still existed beyond tribal boundaries. One woman said Jake had treated Mary as family when her own family could not be there, and for that they would always consider him family in return. The ceremony continued with songs. Voices rose together in harmonies that seemed to come from the earth itself. Jake did not understand the words, but he felt their meaning in his chest. Grief and celebration mixed together, honoring both the sadness of loss and the joy of a life well lived. Drums provided rhythm, steady heartbeat sounds that connected everyone in the circle. Jake found himself swaying slightly, pulled into the shared experience. Then gifts were brought forward. One by one, people approached Jake and offered items they had brought. He received blankets woven with intricate patterns, each one representing hours of work and traditional designs. He was given dried meats and preserved foods, enough to last through the winter. Someone presented him with a knife in a hand-tooled leather sheath. Another person gave him snowshoes made the traditional way with wood and rawhide. A young woman brought forward a beautiful carved figure of an eagle. She explained through Helen that the eagle was a sacred symbol, a connection between earth and sky. She wanted Jake to have it as a reminder that he would always have the protection of the Shoshone people. Jake accepted it with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the generosity. These were not token gifts. These were items of real value, both practical and spiritual. Chief Red Cloud himself presented the final gift. It was a ceremonial blanket unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The wool was soft and thick, dyed in rich colors of red, black, white, and blue. Geometric patterns covered its surface, each design holding meaning that Helen tried to explain. The blanket told a story, she said. Mary's story and now Jake's story woven together. It represented honor, courage, compassion, and the bonds that connected all people regardless of their origins. The chief draped the blanket over Jake's shoulders with ceremony and care. He spoke in both Shoshone and English, declaring that Jake Morrison was now an honorary member of their tribe. He would have a place at their fires, a voice in their councils, and the support of their community. They would be his people just as he had become one of theirs. The crowd erupted in approval, voices shouting and hands clapping. Jake stood there wrapped in the blanket, tears streaming down his face, feeling something break open inside his chest. For 7 years he had believed that isolation protected him from pain. For 7 years he had avoided connection because losing people hurt too much. But standing in this circle, surrounded by 200 strangers who had become family, Jake understood what Mary had been trying to tell him. Connection was not weakness. Connection was what made being human meaningful. Yes, it could lead to pain when you lost people, but it also led to moments like this, moments of belonging and acceptance that made life worth living. The ceremony concluded with a prayer from Chief Red Cloud. He asked the spirits to guide Mary's journey, to bless Jake for his kindness, and to remind everyone present that they were all related, all connected in the great circle of life. When he finished, people began to disperse to prepare the evening feast. But many stopped by Jake first, touching his hand or shoulder, speaking words of welcome and gratitude. Each touch felt like healing, like pieces of his frozen heart beginning to thaw. Helen remained with Jake as the crowd thinned. She smiled at him with grandmotherly affection. She told him this was just the beginning. Over the next few days he would learn more about their ways, meet many people, and start to understand what it meant to be part of the Shoshone family. For now he should rest and let his heart absorb what had happened. Big changes were happening inside him, whether he realized it yet or not. Jake nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He clutched the ceremonial blanket tighter and looked around at the camp that had sprung up around his lonely cabin. Everything had changed, and somehow that felt exactly right. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the clearing, preparations for the feast intensified. Jake watched from a seat near the central fire, still wearing the ceremonial blanket draped over his shoulders. The camp had fully taken shape now, a temporary village that felt surprisingly permanent. Smoke rose from multiple cooking fires. The smell of roasting meat and baking bread filled the mountain air. Children ran between the tents playing games while elders sat in groups talking quietly. Helen had left Jake to rest, but he found himself unable to sit idle for long. 7 years of solitary self-reliance made him uncomfortable being served while others worked. He stood and approached one of the cooking fires where several women were preparing food. He asked if he could help, but they smiled and shook their heads. Today he was the honored guest. His job was to receive their hospitality. One of the women, maybe 40 years old with kind eyes, gestured for him to sit near them so they could talk while they worked. Her name was Linda Whitebird. She explained that she was Mary's youngest daughter. Jake's stomach tightened with emotion. He started to apologize, to say he wished he could have done more, but Linda stopped him gently. Her mother had died peacefully, cared for by a good person in a place of natural beauty. That was more than many people received. Linda's family was grateful beyond words. They had feared finding Mary dead and alone on some frozen mountainside. Instead, they had found evidence of compassion and respect. Linda told Jake about growing up with Mary as her mother. She spoke of patient lessons in beadwork and cooking, of stories told on winter nights, of a woman who had survived hardship after hardship, but never lost her capacity for joy. Mary had buried 3 children who died young, had lived through poverty and discrimination, had watched her husband decline slowly from illness, yet she had remained strong, finding meaning in preserving traditions and caring for her extended family. Other women joined the conversation as they worked. They asked Jake questions about his life. Where was he from originally? What had brought him to these mountains? Did he have family? Jake found himself opening up in ways he had not done in years. He told them about growing up in Wyoming, about serving in the military, about meeting his wife and having a daughter. He even told them about the accident, the loss, the decision to disappear into the wilderness. The women listened without judgment or pity. One of them, an older woman named Betty Clearwater, nodded with understanding. She had lost her husband and 2 sons in a car accident 15 years ago. The pain, she said, never fully disappeared, but it did change over time. Learning to carry it rather than run from it was the hard part, but running only made the burden heavier because you carried it alone. She had learned to let her community help hold the weight. That made it bearable. Their words sank deep into Jake's consciousness. He had believed isolation was protection, but maybe it had just been prolonging his suffering. These people had experienced terrible losses too, but they had stayed connected to each other. They had leaned on community and tradition, rather than retreating from the world. Perhaps that was the wiser path. Perhaps that was what Mary had been trying to show him in her final hours. As evening approached, the feast was ready. Long tables had been constructed from fallen logs and planks. Food covered every surface. Jake saw traditional dishes he did not recognize alongside more familiar fare. There was roasted venison and elk, fried bread that steamed when broken open, stews thick with vegetables and beans, corn prepared 6 different ways. There were pies and cakes brought from the reservations, store-bought items sitting beside handmade traditional foods. The abundance overwhelmed him. Chief Red Cloud called everyone to gather. The entire community assembled around the tables and central fire. The chief asked for silence, then spoke a blessing in Shoshone. Helen, standing near Jake again, whispered that he was thanking the spirits for the food, for the safe journey, for bringing them together, and for Jake's kindness to Mary. When the blessing ended, the chief gestured to Jake. He was to be served first, another mark of honor. Jake felt his face flush with embarrassment as a plate was prepared for him with samples of everything. The portions were generous, far more than he could eat. He was guided to a special seat near the central fire with the chief and other elders. He wanted to protest, but Helen caught his eye and shook her head slightly. "Accept the honor gracefully," her look said. So Jake sat and received the plate with murmured thanks. Only after Jake had been served did everyone else line up to fill their plates. Families ate together in small groups around the clearing. The sound of conversation and laughter filled the air. Jake tasted the food carefully, finding flavors he had never experienced. The fried bread was warm and slightly sweet. The venison had been prepared with herbs that gave it an earthy richness. Everything tasted of care and tradition, recipes passed down through generations. Chief Red Cloud sat beside Jake and they ate in comfortable silence for a while. Then the chief asked about Jake's life before the mountains. Jake found himself telling stories he had not shared in years, about his childhood on a ranch, about learning to track and hunt from his grandfather, about the military and the places he had seen. The chief listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that showed genuine interest. In return, the chief shared his own story. He spoke of growing up on the reservation during hard times, of fighting to preserve Shoshone language and culture, while also preparing young people for the modern world. He talked about the challenges his people faced, poverty and addiction and loss of traditions. But he also spoke with pride about resilience, about young people who were reclaiming their heritage, about small victories in the ongoing struggle to maintain identity and dignity. Jake felt humbled by the chief's openness. Here was a man who led hundreds of people, who carried the weight of preserving an entire culture, and he spoke to Jake as an equal. More than that, he spoke to him as family. The barriers Jake had built around himself seemed increasingly pointless. These people had welcomed him completely despite knowing him for mere hours. They offered connection without demanding anything in return except that he accept it. As full darkness fell, drums began to play. Not the ceremonial drums from earlier, but more relaxed rhythms. People started to dance. Traditional movements mixed with modern steps. Children joined in, copying their elders with varying degrees of success. Laughter rang out when someone stumbled or improvised an unexpected move. The atmosphere shifted from solemn ceremony to joyful celebration. Several people tried to coax Jake to join the dancing, but he declined, too self-conscious and uncertain. He was content to watch and absorb the scene. This was what community looked like. Not perfect, not without pain or problems, but alive and connected. People of all ages sharing space and time together, honoring their past while living in the present. Jake had forgotten such things existed. An old woman made her way slowly to where Jake sat. She had to be 80 or more. Her face a map of wrinkles, her movements careful but determined. She sat beside him with a soft grunt. Helen appeared and introduced her. This was Susan Greywolf, Mary's closest friend since childhood. The two women had been more like sisters than friends, having grown up together and raised their families side by side. Susan took Jake's hand in both of hers. Her skin felt papery, but her grip was strong. She looked into his eyes with an intensity that made him unable to look away. She thanked him in heavily accented English for caring for Mary. She said that knowing Mary had not died alone, that someone had shown her kindness and respect, brought peace to everyone who had loved her. Susan had been preparing herself to find Mary's body abandoned on some mountainside, victim to exposure and scavengers. Instead, she had found evidence of compassion. Susan told Jake that Mary had always believed in the goodness of people despite many reasons to believe otherwise. She had taught her children and grandchildren to look for the humanity in others, regardless of their background. Finding Jake had proven Mary right one final time. Good people existed everywhere. You just had to be willing to see them. Susan squeezed Jake's hand once more, then stood and shuffled back toward the fire, leaving him sitting with tears in his eyes. The feast continued late into the night. Stories were shared around the fires, some in English, some in Shoshone, all met with laughter or thoughtful nods. Jake listened and learned. He heard about reservation life, about struggles and triumphs, about keeping traditions alive in a world that often seemed determined to erase them. He heard about individuals like Mary who had dedicated their lives to cultural preservation. He heard about hope for the future despite all the challenges. Eventually, people began to drift toward their tents. The fires were banked but not extinguished, kept alive through the night. Jake stood to return to his cabin, but Chief Red Cloud stopped him. The chief said they had prepared a tent for Jake if he wished to stay near the central fire. It would honor them if he remained with the community, rather than isolating himself in his cabin. Jake hesitated only a moment before agreeing. The thought of sleeping alone suddenly seemed less appealing than being surrounded by this temporary family. Helen showed him to the tent, a traditional structure that had been erected near the chief's own dwelling. Inside were thick. The fourth morning arrived with a different energy in the camp. People moved more slowly, packing gear and preparing for departure. The temporary village that had felt so alive and permanent would soon be dismantled, leaving no trace except memories and the warmth that lingered in hearts. Jake woke with a hollow feeling in his chest. These people had become family in just a few days. Watching them leave would hurt, even though he knew it was necessary. He emerged from his tent to find Chief Red Cloud already awake and watching the sunrise. The chief gestured for Jake to join him. They stood together in silence for several minutes. Two men comfortable enough with each other to not need words. Finally, the chief spoke. He said that endings were also beginnings. The Shoshone people would return to their reservations and regular lives, but they would carry Jake with them in their hearts. And Jake would carry them in his. The chief pulled something from his jacket, a small device that looked out of place in this traditional gathering. It was a satellite phone. He explained that he wanted Jake to have a way to contact them if he needed anything. Emergencies, questions, or just the desire to talk. The phone worked anywhere, even in these remote mountains. Numbers for the chief and several other key people were already programmed in. This was not goodbye, but rather the beginning of an ongoing relationship. Jake accepted the phone with shaking hands. It represented a lifeline to the world, a thread connecting his isolation to community. He tried to express his gratitude, but words felt inadequate. The chief simply gripped his shoulder and nodded. Some things did not need to be spoken. Understanding passed between them without language. People began approaching Jake to say their farewells. Many brought final small gifts. Susan Greywolf gave him a photograph of Mary, a picture from decades ago showing a beautiful young woman with a bright smile. Susan said she wanted Jake to remember Mary as she had been in life, vibrant and full of joy, not just the dying elder he had cared for. Jake promised to treasure it. Danny Eaglefeather invited Jake to visit the reservation anytime. He offered to teach him more traditional skills and to learn Jake's wilderness knowledge in return. They could combine the best of both approaches. Jake agreed, surprising himself with his own enthusiasm. A month ago, the idea of committing to any future interaction would have been impossible. Now it felt natural. Linda Whitebird, Mary's daughter, asked Jake a favor. She wanted his permission to maintain the gravesite. The family planned to return regularly to tend it and leave offerings. They wanted to create a more permanent marker, something that would last years instead of seasons. If Jake was comfortable with it, they could build a small memorial that would honor Mary properly. Jake agreed immediately, moved that they asked his permission at all. Amy, the chief's granddaughter, hugged Jake goodbye. She made him promise to write to her about the things he saw in the mountains. She wanted to learn from his observations. Jake promised, realizing he was committing to regular contact with this energetic teenager. The thought made him smile instead of panic. Maybe he was ready for this kind of connection again. The dismantling of the camp proceeded with the same efficiency as its construction. Tents came down and were packed away. Fires were properly extinguished. Every trace of occupation was carefully removed except for one thing. The stone circle where ceremonies had been held remained. Chief Red Cloud explained that they wanted to leave it as a permanent marker of what had happened here. A place of honor and transformation. As people mounted horses or prepared to walk down the mountain, Susan Greywolf approached Jake one final time. She was not leaving with the main group. She asked if she might stay a few extra days to properly tend Mary's grave and to spend more time at the site. Her grandson Peter, a quiet young man in his 20s, would stay with her to provide assistance. If Jake did not mind the company, they could stay in the clearing near his cabin. Jake found himself genuinely pleased by the request. The transition from 200 people to complete isolation would have been jarring. Having Susan and Peter remain for a while felt right. He told them they were welcome to stay as long as they wished. Susan's wrinkled face lit up with a smile. She said they would work on the gravesite during the day, but she also wanted to teach Jake some Shoshone phrases. Every family member should know at least a little of the language. The departure began. Chief Red Cloud led the procession down the mountain trail, the same trail they had climbed just days ago. People waved and called out farewells as they filed past Jake's cabin. He stood on his porch, still wrapped in the ceremonial blanket, watching them go. The sight stirred emotions he could not fully name. Gratitude, sadness, hope, connection. He waved back, his face wet with tears he did not bother to hide. The procession took over an hour to fully pass. 200 people leaving the same way they had arrived, solemn and purposeful. The sounds of horses and footsteps gradually faded into the distance. Finally, only Susan, Peter, and Jake remained in the clearing, that suddenly felt enormous and empty. But it was not the hollow emptiness Jake had known before. It was the emptiness of space waiting to be filled again. Susan suggested they share coffee and make plans. Inside Jake's cabin, which now seemed tiny after days in the camp, the three of them sat at his handmade table. Peter spoke more than Jake had heard during the entire gathering. He was studying to be a teacher, hoping to teach both regular subjects and traditional culture on the reservation. He saw education as a way to bridge the gap between old ways and new realities. Over the next 3 days, Susan and Peter worked on Mary's gravesite. Jake helped, learning as they taught him the proper ways to honor the dead. They expanded the stone border, created a more substantial marker, planted native flowers that would bloom in spring. Susan taught Jake prayers in Shoshone, simple phrases he could say when visiting the grave. The words felt foreign in his mouth but meaningful in his heart. In the evenings, they shared meals and conversation. Susan told stories about Mary that made her come alive in Jake's imagination. Peter talked about his hopes for the future of their people. Jake found himself sharing more about his own life, his past, his regrets, his tentative hopes for moving forward. The two Shoshone visitors listened without judgment, offering perspective from their own experiences with loss and survival. On the morning Susan and Peter prepared to leave, Jake walked them down the trail part way. Susan hugged him like a grandmother sending off a beloved grandson. She made him promise to use the satellite phone, to stay connected, to not disappear back into isolation. She said Mary had given him a gift by crossing his path. Wasting that gift by returning to loneliness would dishonor her memory. Jake promised to try, to take small steps toward reconnecting with life. After they disappeared down the trail, Jake returned to his cabin. For the first time in 7 years, it felt like a home rather than a hiding place. The gifts from the Shoshone people filled the space with color and meaning. The ceremonial blanket hung on the wall. The carved eagle sat on his table. The photograph of young Mary smiled from a shelf he had cleared. Days passed and Jake found himself following through on his promises. He used the satellite phone to call Chief Red Cloud and report that Susan and Peter had made it back safely. The conversation was brief but warm. The chief invited Jake to visit the reservation for the winter solstice ceremony. Jake said he would think about it, not committing but not refusing either. That felt like progress. A week later, Jake made a decision that surprised himself. He hiked down to Pine Ridge, the nearest town, for the first time in 7 years. The walk took most of a day. People stared at him, this hermit who had become local legend. But Jake met their eyes and nodded greetings. He bought supplies, chatted briefly with the store owner, even accepted an invitation to have coffee with the local sheriff, who wanted to hear about the Shoshone gathering. The sheriff, a weathered man named Harold, listened to Jake's story with interest. He said word had spread through the region about what happened. People were talking about the mountain hermit who had earned the respect of Native Americans. Some folks thought it was inspiring, this story of kindness crossing cultural divides. Harold asked if Jake might consider leading wilderness survival courses for local youth. The community could use someone with his skills. Jake did not commit, but he did not refuse. He said he would think about it. That seemed to be his new pattern. Not jumping back into the world all at once, but not hiding from it either. Taking small steps, testing the water, seeing what felt right. The transformation Mary had started was continuing at its own pace. Back at his cabin, Jake began a new routine. He still trapped and hunted and maintained his solitary life. But he also wrote letters to Amy about his observations of wildlife and weather patterns. He practiced Shoshone phrases Susan had taught him. He visited Mary's grave regularly and spoke to her about how his life was changing. He kept the satellite phone charged and accessible. Winter arrived in full force. Snow buried the mountains and Jake prepared to hunker down for the cold months. But this winter felt different from the previous 7. He was not trapped by isolation, but choosing temporary solitude with the knowledge that connection waited when he was ready. The ceremonial blanket kept him warm. The food gifted by the Shoshone people. Morning came with the sound of camp waking around him. Jake emerged from the tent to find people already moving with purpose. Fires were being rebuilt, breakfast prepared, children corralled for morning routines. The efficiency and organization impressed him. This was not chaos but a well-practiced system where everyone knew their role. He felt useless standing there watching, so he found Helen and asked what he could do to help. She smiled and told him today was about learning. Chief Red Cloud wanted Jake to understand more about Shoshone culture and traditions. Several elders had volunteered to teach him throughout the day. His job was to be a student, to ask questions, to open himself to new knowledge. Jake nodded, feeling both excited and nervous. He had spent 7 years avoiding anything that required emotional engagement. Now he was being asked to dive deep into unfamiliar territory. After a breakfast of eggs and fried bread, Jake was taken to meet a man named George Stoneheart. George was a storyteller, a keeper of oral traditions who had learned the old tales from his grandfather. He sat Jake down near one of the fires and began to speak. His voice had a rhythmic quality that suggested centuries of practice, stories refined through countless retellings. George told creation stories, tales of how the Shoshone people came to be, and how they learned to live in harmony with the land. He spoke of Coyote the trickster, whose foolish actions often taught important lessons. He told stories of brave warriors and wise women, of challenges overcome and traditions preserved. Each story carried layers of meaning, some obvious and some subtle. Jake listened intently, recognizing universal themes wrapped in culturally specific details. Between stories, George explained the importance of oral tradition. These tales were not just entertainment, but education. They taught children about values, about history, about their place in the world. In cultures without written language, storytellers like George were living libraries. The responsibility was enormous. Each time a story was told, it had to be remembered perfectly so it could be passed to the next generation unchanged. Jake asked why the stories mattered so much. In the modern world where everything could be written down or recorded, George smiled and said that hearing a story spoken was different from reading words on a page. The human voice carried emotion and nuance that text could not capture. Stories told around fires created community, brought generations together. made the past feel alive and relevant. These traditions connected modern Shoshone people to their ancestors in ways that books never could. The morning passed quickly. Jake found himself absorbed in the stories and the philosophy behind them. George's passion for his role as keeper of traditions was infectious. This was not some quaint hobby, but a vital link in preserving identity and culture. Jake thought about his own heritage, how little he knew about his ancestors' stories. Maybe everyone needed these connections to the past to understand who they were in the present. After lunch, Jake was handed over to a group of younger men who wanted to show him traditional skills. They demonstrated how to make rope from plant fibers, how to start fire without matches using a bow drill, how to track animals by reading subtle signs in dirt and vegetation. Jake had wilderness skills from his years alone, but these men showed him techniques he had never considered. They worked with efficiency born of practice, turning natural materials into useful tools. One of the men, a guy in his 30s named Danny Eaglefeather, told Jake about the challenge of keeping these skills alive. Young people on the reservation often saw traditional knowledge as irrelevant in the modern world. They wanted jobs and education and connection to mainstream culture. But Danny and others like him worked to show that traditional skills and modern life were not incompatible. Understanding where you came from gave you strength to navigate where you were going. Danny asked Jake why he had isolated himself for so long. Jake found himself giving an honest answer. He had been afraid. Afraid of getting close to people and losing them again. Afraid of the pain that came with connection. Isolation had seemed safer even if it meant being lonely. Danny nodded with understanding. He said many people on the reservation struggled with similar feelings. Historical trauma, loss, pain passed down through generations. Some people dealt with it through isolation, others through addiction. The healthier path was leaning on community, but that required courage. Their conversation was interrupted by excited shouts from some children. Everyone hurried over to see what had happened. A young boy, maybe 8 years old, had successfully started a fire using the bow drill method for the first time. The adults celebrated his achievement with genuine enthusiasm. The boy beamed with pride. Danny told Jake this was why the traditions mattered. This child would remember this moment forever. He would tell his own children someday about learning traditional firemaking. The connection to ancestors continued through moments like this. As afternoon turned to evening, Jake was taken to Mary's grave. A large group had gathered there, maybe 50 people. They had brought flowers and small items to leave as offerings. Chief Red Cloud led another ceremony. This one focused entirely on honoring Mary's memory. People spoke about what she had meant to them, sharing memories and tears. Jake listened and learned more about the woman he had known for only 2 days. Susan Greywolf spoke longest, her voice shaking with emotion. She talked about growing up with Mary, about getting in trouble together as girls, about supporting each other through marriages and children and grandchildren. She spoke about watching Mary care for her dying husband with such devotion, about how Mary had seemed lost after his death, untethered from the world. The spiritual journey that had ended at Jake's cabin had been Mary's way of trying to find peace and purpose again. Susan turned to look directly at Jake. She said that Mary had found what she was looking for in those final hours. Not her husband's spirit in the mountains, but something equally important. She had found proof that kindness and decency still existed in the world, that a stranger would care for a dying woman without expecting anything in return. That humanity could transcend all the boundaries people erected between themselves. Mary's death had been a gift to Jake, Susan said, but Jake's kindness had been an equal gift to Mary. After the ceremony, people began leaving small offerings at the grave. Tobacco, cornmeal, small carved figures, flowers. Jake waited until most had finished, then approached alone. He had nothing to leave except words. He spoke quietly to Mary as if she could hear. He thanked her for teaching him in such a short time, for reminding him what mattered, for being the catalyst that brought 200 people into his life and showed him that connection was worth the risk of pain. That evening's gathering was more relaxed than the feast. People sat in small groups talking and laughing. Jake found himself pulled into different conversations, meeting more people, hearing more stories. A teenage girl named Amy Red Cloud, the chief's granddaughter, asked Jake to teach her some wilderness survival tricks. He showed her how to find north without a compass by looking at moss growth and star positions. She soaked up the information eagerly, asking smart questions. Amy told Jake she wanted to be a park ranger someday. She loved the outdoors but also wanted to help preserve natural places for future generations. She saw it as connected to her heritage, this idea of living in balance with the land rather than dominating it. Jake found himself encouraging her dreams, telling her about the parks he had visited before his isolation. The conversation reminded him of talks he used to have with his daughter. The memory hurt, but in a sweet way rather than a devastating one. As night deepened, Jake sat with Chief Red Cloud near the central fire. They had been talking for hours, the chief sharing insights about leadership and responsibility. Jake asked how the chief balanced preserving tradition with adapting to modern realities. The chief said it was like walking a tightrope, always finding the middle path. Some traditions needed to be kept exactly as they had always been. Others could evolve while maintaining their essential spirit. The trick was knowing which was which and having the wisdom to make good choices. The chief asked Jake what he planned to do now. Would he return to isolation or consider reconnecting with the world? Jake admitted he did not know. The past few days had shaken everything he thought he understood about himself. He had believed he wanted to be alone, but this gathering had awakened something he thought was dead. The hunger for connection, for meaning, for being part of something larger than just survival. Chief Red Cloud said that Jake had a choice to make, but he did not have to make it immediately. The Shoshone people would remain his family whether he chose to engage with them regularly or not. They would check on him, invite him to ceremonies, include him in the community. But the degree of connection was up to Jake. He could take small steps or large ones. The important thing was to move forward rather than remaining frozen in grief and isolation. That night, as Jake lay in his tent listening to the camp settle around him, he felt something shifting inside himself. For 7 years he had been stuck, trapped in the moment of losing his wife and daughter. Mary's death in this gathering had somehow unstuck him. The pain was still there, but it no longer paralyzed him. He could feel it without being destroyed by it.